I'm going to be preaching on the parable of the prodigal son. Now, we have had lots of preaching about this, and you've had the scripture and warning about this, so hopefully you've spent time and have read Luke chapter 15. Right. I'm not going to read it again. I am going to trust that you've done it, but I will quickly paraphrase the story. There are two boys. A man has two boys. And the younger son comes to the father and he says, Dad, I want to have my inheritance early. So the father divides the inheritance between the two sons, and off the younger son goes. And he lives his life with a pleasurable, seeking of pleasure, seeking comfort, and he blows all the money, blows all his inheritance, ends up with the pigs, because he can't support himself, his friends all leave him, and he's destitute. At that moment, he thinks, I must come back to the father. So he comes back to his father's house, wanting to be a servant because he thought it would be a better option. We know that the father runs and greets the son, and we embraces him, put rings and robes and shoes and all that kind of stuff, brings him in, throws a big party, and then the elder brother comes along and says, this is not fair. This is not fair. I've been working so hard, you've done nothing for me. And so the father then goes out to the son and says, hey, come on, we have to. Your brother was dead, now he's alive, we've got to celebrate. Now, there's a whole lot of stuff we don't know in this story. We don't know if the son ever comes back, or if he goes off miffed. We don't know. It's a very open-ended story. And we have had tons and tons and tons of teaching on this parable. But what I want to do today, I don't know about you, but whenever I have the parable, I sit and I identify with the sons, and I think, which son am I? And you go through that prodigal, and it's been a long time since I felt prodigal, I must be honest. And I've, for many years, have identified more with the older brother. And I've worked on that, and I've processed a whole lot of stuff, and I've asked God to help me, and I don't want to be religious, and I don't want to be judgmental, and I don't want to be all those things. And so, well, that doesn't really leave me with too many other options. So you sort of feel a bit bad. And I felt a bit better when I read Rob Bell's book, and the book that he was kicked out of the church for, that Love Wins, and I absolutely loved the book. I only read it about a year ago, and I think it's old, it's about 10 years old. And I just love the fact that both the prodigal and the elder son, God spoke a better word over each of them. Different words, but better words. And the first one was, you're my son who was dead, and now you're alive, let's have a party. And the other one was, everything I have is yours. All that I have, you've been with me all this time. And that for me was such a gem to hold on to. What a beautiful word. What a beautiful promise. Do we want anything more? But instead we start beating ourselves up because we feel, maybe I'm a little bit religious here, and I do that, and I do the next thing. But there's a third character, and we've used that character to a large extent to display who God is. Because we do know that parables tell us three things. One, they tell us about how the kingdom works. Two, they tell us about God's heart. And three, they tell us about our hearts. That's the function of parables. They tell us three things. So, yes, obviously he represents the Father, and we can get to know him. But we stop at the point of the elder brother. You see, the Father it didn't actually say he was God. What the Father did was he showed us the third option of how we love with maturity. And so that's where I'm going to be heading onto today, because actually we're part of all three. All three of those things are part of us, and sometimes we manifest as the prodigal. And just to simplify things, prodigal is a big word, and we know it identifies the story. But the meaning of that word prodigal is just weak. It's not backslider, it's not unsaved, it's just weak. So there are times when we act like the prodigal. There are times like we act like the older brother. And hopefully there are more and more and more times that we're going to be starting to act like the Father in the situation. So we know that it's all about what's happening in us. 2 Corinthians 13 verse 5 says, do you not recognize this about yourselves? Jesus Christ is in you. This is what it's about, discovering who Jesus is inside of us. When we start to integrate, once we get to know who God is, and we start to integrate who he is within us, that's when we start to change. So if we look at the son realm, what was happening in his life? Basically, he was running away from pain and looking to satisfy that pain with a whole stack of pleasure. So whenever we find ourselves not wanting to go to those hard places and deal with that pain, let that be a little ding-dong, I'm reacting like the prodigal here. Because when there's pain, and that pain can be anything. It can be, why do I find my significance in being successful? Why do I need to please people all the time? Well, you know, these things we bandied around for years and years. Every time you function in that way, let it be a little red flag that goes, ding dong, I'm acting like the prodigal here. I don't want to go to those hard, difficult places, have those hard, difficult conversations, think about those hard spaces when my mother hurt me terribly as a child. It's easier to avoid it and plaster on the Holy Spirit, and I'm just going to be healed, and we don't ever go to that place. We can't move on. We're acting like the prodigal. We're running away from those hard spaces. So whenever we satisfy our needs with shallow friendships, money, good jobs, good cars, whatever we need to make us feel better, we're just being a prodigal, running away from dealing with that real pain. And so, you know, Matt spoke about this waiting period. Well, it's blooming hard to wait. It's awful because you don't know what to do. You don't know what to expect. Like Abraham didn't know what to expect, being a different role. You don't know. You don't know. You want control. And that's the Father makes that time, and He extends it so that we have got time to go and deal with that pain and that insecurity and all those feelings. He says, use it, but don't run away to a far distant land and avoid it. Step into the waiting thing and say, God, this is the thing. Let me process all this difficult stuff. And it's all stuff that comes out of us. It's flesh. We have to process it. We have to allow Him into those spaces. And I'm going to give us some tips now. When the son was with the pigs, and he said, you know what, I'm going to go back to my dad because I can be a servant there, and they get fed better than the pigs. And I would be able to be far more happy. Well, everything. I'm going to go back to my dad, and I'm not going to go back as a son, I'm going to go back as a servant. And hopefully He'll accept me as a hired hand. See, it really just shows and exposes that shame that he was feeling. I'm not good enough. I'm really not good enough for my dad. What do you think would have happened if the son had run back and said, Dad, I missed you so much. I know that I just love you so much. Well, it could have been completely different. But he comes relationally crippled and he says, let me just be a servant. Father, let me be small because I feel small. And so the prodigal comes back full of shame. And we do that too. We come back with shame. Now, what if he'd come back and said, flung his arms around his father and just said, Dad, I love you. I've missed you. I've messed up. Please forgive me. But he didn't. He came back carrying all his shame. And one of the greatest deceptions that is in the church is that we should keep on feeling shame. You know, shame is dealt with at the cross. And if you need to have scriptures to check that, it's 2 Corinthians 5:21, Colossians 2:13-15, and Hebrews 10:12-14. Shame is crucified on the cross. But we come into the church with our shame, and then we encounter God, and we say, let me be small. Let me be small because I feel small. And if I'm small, I'm just so humble. Because I'll be small, and I'll stay small, and I'll be miserable. Because then I'll feel as if I'm working. I'm really doing this for God. I don't want to get above my station, because I must feel the shame. And what we do is that we live with the shame, and we invite it into the church, and we settle with it, and we all scuttle around, and we never address our shame. We just cloak it to make it look comfortable and acceptable in the church. Brene Brown, who's really the shame expert, She says that we feel shame when we haven't done something, or we do something, and that makes us feel less than, we're not enough, and it makes us feel as if we don't deserve connection. So we hide. Church is a wonderful place to hide, people. We have got masks down pat. It's time for us to take our masks off. Shame is an attack on our identity. It keeps us crippled, and it keeps us in that place of just not wanting to connect, of not wanting to be vulnerable, of not wanting to share how terrible we really are so that we can become great in God's sight. Because we feel so self-comfortable and pious when we walk around. And you can be in the church for 100 years, actually, and still be dealing from that place of shame and thinking you're nice and humble. And we do. It's not just the new believer coming in who's the prodigal. It's all of us when we start to hide away from dealing with what God has been pointing us to deal with. But you see, it doesn't just stay as shame. What happens in that prodigal thing? The process that keeps shame so crippled, what keeps us crippled in that place, is that we add self-contempt. That feeling of, I must be bad, I must be less than. And we feed it. That self-contempt comes in here. And self-contempt is not low self-esteem. It's actually contempt for self. I don't like me. I'll hide it. I'll pretend to be someone else so you don't see me. Because I really don't like me. But what self-contempt does is it comes in a form of language. And it penetrates us, and it allows all that undealt with shame, and we sit with it and we hide it, and that shame metastasizes because it's undealt with. And it becomes self-condemnation. So now not only do we feel shame and we feel we're not worthy of connection, we start feeling contempt and bad about ourselves. And the next thing we do is we start condemning ourselves. We're the prodigal. We're weak. We can't be who God's called us to be. But if we put that, how it happens is that we have this undealt with shame and we start feeling bad about ourselves and condemning ourselves. Satan's waiting. As soon as we sort of invite that self-contempt contempt, we invite it onto the porch of our lives. It's like Satan's got the legal right to come in, and he jumps straight in and he becomes the voice that we listen to. It's all about evil with a whole stack of lies mixed in with a good measure of truth. And we start hearing this voice. You're bad. You're useless. You're not as good as. And we just become self-condemning. All self-contempt is the barrier to transformative love. Someone can love you till they're blue in the face, but if the words inside your head is you're useless, you can't be transformed. Stops you being transformed. The stories of shame that bear the most hold, let me just get this right. Those stories that we carry with our shame stories, those will control and power the rest of your life. We've got to get them out and get rid of those stories. Because otherwise you're going to be controlled by that story. So then we move on to the older brother. So we all have times when we're the younger son, and then we have times as well where we can move into the place of being the older brother. So what happens with the older brother? You see, it's so easy to hijack the gospel about this free righteousness, this free grace. It just seems too good to be true. And so we hijack it. And we say, well, work hard. Do the right things. Check the right boxes. Put in the effort. Put in the space. We can do something about this. Good behavior becomes the elder brother's mantra. You see, and this posture that I'm holier than you. I did this. I went to all the prayer meetings, and I'm up there. this holier than you thing, is where we start feeling the control. Because if I feel better than you, if I feel as if I'm seen to be more successful in Christendom than you, or in the church than you, I'm in control. I can start manipulating my position. And it's all just favor. I don't know why God chooses what to give us the gifts that He does, but He does. And we've just got to learn to accept them and enjoy them. Because in enjoying them and discovering who He is, we will be so satisfied with everything He gives us because He's a good Father. But there is this whole thing of entitlement. Because do you know that as much as the level that you sacrifice to, just because we're human, is going to be the level that you feel entitled. I sacrifice a whole lot, and I go to all the prayer meetings, and I do all things that I'm going to do, well, then surely some good must come my way. So the level that we sacrifice, our time, our effort, our talents, our everything, we've got to be so careful that we don't think that's the sacrifice because that's the prize, or that's the reward. He's our reward. He's our reward. Always, He's our reward. So, you know that He wanted justice. He wanted to, when He comes back, actually we don't really know too much about the prostitutes that happened until the brother, who hadn't even seen him come home, but I don't know if he heard about it, but he said, "And you wasted all your money on prostitutes." We start validating our position in that judgment. We validate our righteousness, our self-righteousness, and we convince ourselves actually that we just deserve more from God, because look how good we are in this process. We scream for justice. It's about being right. And you know what? When others aren't working as hard as us, you get bitter about that. Why? You should be working hard. This is about working. And our noses get seriously put out of joint when someone else, and I mean, this is an example. Someone gets their God blesses them and pays their rent. And then you hear people say, "Well, I don't think that's fair, He doesn't pay my rent. I work really, really hard." We've got to watch those things. I mean, that's a really blatant example. That's the subtle little things that will get us all the time. If we can, we're human. Every time we start being judgmental and feeling right and defending our position of right, we get dopamine that's released in our brains that makes us feel really, really good. So it feels good to be right. But the elder brother also liked feeling good to be right. What happens when we spend the time working hard is that it means that I'm still inside feeling that shame of I'm not good enough. Working really hard. But in that process, I don't want you to see that I'm really not really feeling very good about me. And I have these reels in my mind about how useless I am, and how bad I am, and how weak I am, and how lonely I must be. And all those positions of shame, they stay there. But the more we work, instead of working that shame through and out, we work to hide it. And what happens, very simply, is all that self-content. I don't want you to see it. I don't want you to see how weak I'm feeling. So, let me look around. Hey, I can see the bad in you. Let me tell you about the bad in that person, because if you're looking at that person there and seeing all the bad in there, you're not going to see me. And as a church, we are so elder brotherish, because we love to say, "Do you know about that person, what they've done? Do you know what they're doing? Let me point a finger there, or let me point a finger there, or maybe over there, but please don't look at me." And if I'm the one who's speaking loudly, I can get away and feel safe. But all the time, I turn that self-contempt that I'm blaming me, and I'm now saying, well, it's not just good enough for me to hear those words. Let me turn it around, and I'm going to start using that contempt on everyone else, just to keep me safe. Because being vulnerable is very difficult. Every time there's conflict, what comes around? Fear. We let fear rule instead of love. Who can I point to? Who can I distract so that you can't see how bad I'm really and small I'm really feeling? Let me go on the attack. When you start protecting our hearts and saying, I don't want you to see what's inside of me, whether we just hide down and disconnect, or whether we blame other people, whatever that might be, it's a sense of control. It's a sense of being in control. Because I'm manipulating things. It guards if I'm guarding what's going on in here, I'm controlling a whole lot of things that's happening because you can't get there. And we feel as if we're in control because I can manipulate what's going on. We've got to learn to deal with that. We've got to learn to bring it out. We've got to learn to deal with being betrayed. Because the elder brother was also betrayed. His brother took off the inheritance. It affected their wealth because now they've got less capital. He also went off and left his brother working hard. It was also betrayal. It was also painful. Just as painful in the thing, but he couldn't love. He couldn't risk because he didn't want to see what anyone else was seeing. Our contempt for others gives us a false sense of control. Whoever determines what is right, and we so often are in that position of trying to be right and be not seen beyond our masks. We're presenting, we're in control, we're manipulating, we're blaming, we're judging all the time. What happens is that we defend our positions to be right. I'm right here. And we miss out on the beautiful opportunity that God wants to work in and through relationships where we can blow us out of the water of who's being betrayed, who's being this, who's being the next thing, because we are actually meant to be relationally functioning in love. But we get on our pedestals because I don't want you to see what's behind. And then we move into the Father realm. Now the Father is this beautiful example of full restoration and healing. We see right from the very beginning. I don't know about you, but it's really hard to let your children go. You spend a whole lot of time training them up and getting them to be obedient and all that stuff. And then you've got to start saying, well, okay, start making your own decisions. How are we going to work through this? And then you think, I'm letting go. And then they leave home and it's all terrible all over again. You say, well, I thought I'd let go, but I haven't really. And it's hard as a parent just to say, well, especially when they're screwing up and you think, no, stop. And you can't, you're powerless to do anything. Instead of manipulating and controlling, you've got to let them go. And the Father demonstrates this. The Father demonstrates this incredible vulnerability. Because he knew that the Son wasn't making the right direction. He knew the shame that was going to be heaped on the family and the disaster and all of that. He knew. He hoped that maybe the Son would come to his senses quicker and come back. But he had an incredibly open hand. And he said, okay, here's your inheritance. You can go. And we've got to be able to love like this, where we are open-handed, where people are attacking us and accusing us, demanding from us. Open your hands, or open your hearts. Because you're only capable of living in this vulnerable place and loving wholeheartedly and vulnerably when you've dealt with your own baggage, your own stuff. But we get hung up in the brother stuff instead of moving into the Father stuff of, yes, I'm going to engage with this hard thing, but I can't love until I've dealt with that stuff. I've got to be able to go to those painful places. I've got to be able to do that. And how do I do this? I start being kind to me. I start being kind to others. And I surrender control. can't control what they're going to do. But it's quite risky, you know, not being able to control, I think. Okay, so we read that the Father was filled with love and compassion in all of these things. And there's a verse, in verse 12, it talks about this word that says, in most of the English translations, it is interpreted, give me my portion of my estate, or my inheritance, and I will, and the Father does. And in our minds, it's monetary. But if we look at the Greek word for that is ousia, which means being or existence. And the word later, and the word for life, is the word bias. So he divides up, the Son says, can you give me my inheritance? And then the Father divides up the inheritance. That's what's translated in the story. But if we look, they're different words. It's ousia and bios. And so if we look at the scripture, as it would be interpreted directly from the Greek, I want to read it to you. The younger then said to the Father, Father, give me the share of your existence that will belong to me. So he divided up his life between them. A few days later, the son, exhausted, and he gathered all that he had and traveled to a far land, and there he squandered his existence in dissolute living. So you know, the Father didn't just give him money. He gave his existence. He gave his being. He gave his life. And then that life was squandered. He prepared for a whole lot. I mean, when he said it was like my son who was dead and now is alive, it was more just than the son that was dead. It was his very being died with that. Loving incredibly riskily, because there's no guarantee of return. It's like saying it's not just money, it's my very existence I'm prepared to give you that you can squander away. It's quite hard when you think about boundaries, because boundaries says this much and no further. And that's a grey area for me. I know that we need boundaries and all that, so I don't want to preach on that sort of thing, but it's above and beyond how we're called to love. That's what mature love looks like, above and beyond. So when someone comes to you and wants to do, and you pour your life out into them, and 2 years later they've had it with you, they're highly offended, they speak terrible things to you, how are you going to respond? Do we say what's right? Do we say what we're justified to say? Do we say, ha, but you did this and you did this, and you're going and squandering your life? Or can we use the words of the Father to say, go in abundance, go in love, go with my blessing, go. It's okay. I was reading something about a pastor who'd written, he said, in that position where you've sown your life into the congregation, and then someone leaves, and you want to just sort of deal with it, you know? And God said to me, what if those words, you're justified to say them, but what if those words keep them from the kingdom forever? How are our words when people hurt us? When people undermine us, when people say things that are nasty and attacking and aggressive, how do we let it go? Remember that. What if the words that I say now affect their eternal destiny? If they turn against God because I'm right, quite a scary place to be. The Father opens up his heart. He relinquishes control, he risks rejection, he embraces brokenness. He models a position of vulnerability and courage. And normally with that, you've got to enter a bit of suffering and loss. Because you see, when he does that, he keeps the door open for restoration. And you and I, we all carry the ministry of reconciliation. That's our mantle, more than anything else. We reconcile man to God. We reconcile each other to each other. We reconcile family to family members. We carry this incredible ministry of reconciliation. It's easier to play it safe and escape like the son, or to get furious and entitled like the big brother. But why don't we start reacting like the Father? You know, the Father didn't just land on earth as a father. He was once a prodigal. He was once an older brother. But he became a father. Rather than, he wasn't stuck in that. You don't become something. You don't just land on earth and say, well, this is who I am, so I don't have to process anything. I don't have to become, I don't have to grow, I don't have to change, I don't have to die to my flesh. Actually, we all do. So that we can all become like the Father. So we can either deal with it in this unconscious thing, I'm not going to love as much, I'm going to hold back, I'm going to love half-heartedly. We're disconnecting and allow shame to get there, and the content, self-content. Or we're going to use turn that content and start aiming it around. And so let me see who I can shoot now with my content so that I feel safe. I've got a big content gun out here, and I can mow down whoever comes close and threatens me. Or we can start to operate in kindness. And in kindness, we've got to discover who God is and discover His kindness. It's the only way we change.